Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack. A few weeks ago, I sat in on a group. It was a betrayal trauma partner group run by a colleague of mine, Allison Martinez, who is a licensed clinical social worker, a certified sex addiction therapist, and a certified multiple addiction therapist. The group was doing an exercise around values and beliefs. And I had a lot of thoughts during the group, and I left thinking, this needs to be a podcast episode. So I asked Allison if I could bring it here on the podcast, and she said yes. That night in group, they were doing an exercise around values and beliefs. The women were writing freely without judgment the values and beliefs that felt true to them. When they started sorting through their values and beliefs, there were some things that shifted that night in group. And there were several moments in the group when someone would have a perplexed look on their face, unsure they understood what she was asking them to do, or if they were doing it right. But they all came up with an answer that seemed true for them. Some of the women seemed surprised at what they thought were the same concept. Different words, but the same idea. However, in the group, they were seeing in real time that while those two ideas, values, and beliefs can overlap, they are two different concepts. Several of them were seeing it differently than they had before. The conversations among the women brought up questions, not just what do I believe, but where did this come from? And is it actually mine? So today's podcast episode is built around those questions. And I want to be clear up front before getting into this podcast episode that this episode is not for one specific population. It's not only for people in betrayal trauma recovery, and it's not only for people in addiction recovery. It's not a clinical breakdown of a therapeutic model. This episode is for anyone who has ever lived inside a system, whether that's a family, a relationship, a religion, or a culture that organized itself around something other than emotional truth, which I'd argue is most of us. The question that runs underneath everything today is which of your values and beliefs are actually yours? And which ones were handed to you, sometimes with love, sometimes with pressure, and sometimes without anyone in the room realizing what was happening. So let's dig into it. I want to start with a question that I don't think people often think about. When someone asks you what your values are, what comes up? What are your go-to responses? Maybe you say things like honesty, family, loyalty, hard work, faith. You might list them quickly, like they're items on a resume. Or maybe you pause and reflect for a minute because you're actually not that sure. So here's a follow-up question. Are those things that you chose or things that you were given? I think many of us have never been asked to look at that difference. We use the words values and beliefs interchangeably in everyday life. I believe in honesty. I value my family. My values tell me to keep going when things get hard. We mix those words together, layer them over each other, and we never stop to ask, are these the same thing? And does it matter if they're not? I would say it matters enormously. And let me explain why. Values are your guiding principles, the qualities that matter most to you and shape how you want to act, how you want to relate, and how you want to make decisions. The key word there is want. Values are often future-facing. They could be also true in the present, but they reflect who you are becoming, not just who you have been. Values tend to resonate. They can be clarified, even a little electric when you land on the right one. There's often a sense of recognition, not obligation, like, oh, this one is mine. Values tend to feel like this matters to me, even when it's hard. Or this is who I want to be, not who I had to be. Or even if no one knew this about me, it would still feel true. Values can be influenced by upbringing and culture. Of course, they can. We don't develop in a vacuum, but they usually don't feel inherited the way beliefs do. When you touch a true value, it doesn't feel like a rule that you're following. It feels like a compass pointing somewhere you actually want to go. Here's a simple test that I will come back to throughout the episode. If something feels like I should, it's probably a belief. If it feels like I choose, it's probably a value. And if it feels like even if no one in my life signed off on this, it would still matter to me, that's almost certainly a value. Beliefs are different. Beliefs are the internal narratives that shape how you interpret your experiences, how safe you feel, how valuable you feel or worthy you feel, how capable you feel. And unlike values, beliefs aren't usually chosen, they're formed. Beliefs tend to feel earned or learned or inherited. They come from what you were taught explicitly, like this is right, this is wrong, and this is how good people act. They also come from what you absorbed implicitly, from watching the adults around you, or from the cultural air that you breathed, from the religious framework that gave your earliest life its shape. And they come from what you conclude from experience, especially from painful experience. This is what happens when I speak up. This is what happens when I trust someone. Or this is what keeps me safe. That last category is what I call survival beliefs. Those aren't chosen. They're learned by a nervous system that was trying to protect you. And often those beliefs work until they don't. Examples of survival beliefs include things like, if I don't comply, I will be rejected. I'm responsible for other people's feelings. My needs are a burden. Safety comes from being good. And if I'm too much, I will be abandoned. These beliefs don't necessarily feel like conclusions. They just feel like facts. And that's because they were formed often before we had the cognitive capacity to question them and to critically think about them. They were formed in a body that was just trying to survive the environment that it was in. The relationship between values and beliefs that I think matters most is that values guide who you want to be, and beliefs influence what feels possible. And that gap between who you want to be and what feels possible is where a lot of suffering lives. It's also the same space where healing happens. You might deeply value connection. You might know somewhere inside that being truly known by another person is something that matters to you. That's a value. But if you carry a belief that was formed in childhood or in a traumatic experience or in some other relationship that taught you that intimacy leads to harm, or that you are fundamentally unlovable, then your value and your belief are in direct conflict. And guess which one tends to win every time? The belief, almost every time. Because beliefs don't just live in the mind, they live in the body. They shape what you perceive, what you expect, and what you allow yourself to reach for. The work in therapy, in recovery, in any genuine healing process is to bring those two things into closer alignment, not by forcing a belief change through positive thinking, but by doing the slower, more honest work of looking at where your beliefs came from, asking yourself whether they're still accurate and whether they're still serving you. So that's what we'll be doing in today's episode. I want to tell you a story that happened when I was a kid. It's not a big story, it's something small that over the years I went through several phases of thinking about and understanding. I would say somewhere when I was between 4 years old and 6 years old, I would come home from playing outside with friends, the neighbor kids, hanging out with other kids, or coming home from school. And I would tell my mom about something that happened. And I would say, that's not fair. Maybe something happened with the neighborhood kids. There were instances when my older sister and her friends excluded me from a game that we were playing outside because they felt like I was too young. That one my mom heard about multiple times because I really did not think that was very fair. My sister and I just had a 2-year gap between us. And sometimes that gap felt enormous to me, even though I didn't really see my sister as being that much older than me. Whatever the situation, I would come home with this strong feeling that something had gone wrong. And the words that I had for it were, that's not fair. My mom's response almost every time would be to say to me, Jackie, life isn't fair. And I remember thinking that answer never was satisfying. It never landed right. But at that age, I didn't have the language to explain why. I actually didn't have the language for that until I was much older. One of the games that we played outside was called Andy I Over. I don't know if anybody out there listening played this game or if you called it the same thing. We'd have a tennis ball, and the houses in the neighborhood I grew up in, my house was actually a great house for playing Andy I Over. So you'd have a big group of kids, and some were in the front yard and some were in the backyard. We'd split into 2 teams. And when you would throw the ball over the roof of the house to the other side, you'd yell out, Andy I Over, and you'd throw the ball as hard as you could over the roof. Well, I think sometimes we played with a tennis ball, but now that I'm thinking about it, I think it was more of a kickball, like those rubber kickballs. Anyway, you'd kick it or you would throw it over the roof, and somebody on the other team would have to catch it without it bouncing, not knowing where on the roof the ball was expected. So you'd spread out as a team and somebody would try to catch it. You had to catch 3 balls. My house had a chain link fence. We had gates on both sides of the house. And when we played, we had the gates open. You just never knew when somebody had caught 3 balls. And when the team did, they'd split and go on 2 sides of the house. One person was holding the ball. They'd try to do a surprise attack to the other team and throw the ball at somebody. If they hit them, they were now on their team. So you tried to end up with the most people. Looking back, I can see that when I was young, I probably couldn't throw the ball over the roof. And maybe I couldn't kick the ball over the roof, but I could try to catch it. There was only a 2-year difference. 2 of the boys that lived in the neighborhood and would often play, who were my sister's age, they would hear me complain about how it wasn't fair because I couldn't play with them and I just had to sit and watch the teams play. One afternoon, late afternoon or evening, after they had played a game of Andy I Over, these two boys, their names were Travis and Sean, took me aside and they were like, okay, we're going to teach you how to throw. And they spent the evening with me teaching me how to throw, how to make the ball go further so that I could get it over the roof, which I really appreciated. You can imagine after that, I thought Sean and Travis were the greatest boys in the world. There was another time when I was a little bit older, I was in sixth grade, and there was a girl who had moved to the school boundaries. Her family was poor. You could tell by the way she looked. She often didn't have her hair combed, not washed very often. And the kids in the school class weren't very nice to her. Looking back, I wouldn't say I was necessarily her friend or nice to her, but we all rode our bike to elementary school. It's what you did back then if the weather was good. Otherwise, you had to walk. We would ride our bikes to elementary school and lock them up on the bike rack. That day, she rode her bike to school. She didn't live from the direction that I was coming from, but she was there locking her bike up and the chain had come off. So she was down trying to put the chain back on her bike and she got her hands greasy, which growing up back then, we all had to know how to get our chain back on the bike. Because if you're out riding bikes, sometimes the chain fell off. So you had to be able to put it back on to ride the bike wherever you were going or to get back home. So her chain had fallen off. I'd seen that happen at that point in my life, probably hundreds of times. And she was bent down putting the chain back on, and her hands were greasy from touching the chain. One of the boys in the class who was standing by the bike rack, started making fun of her for having dirty hands and commenting on her hygiene, particularly focused on her greasy hands. Something in me hit, and I was just like, that is not fair. Her bike chain came off. She put it back on. We've all had to do that. Our hands all get greasy. And I was angry. And I just hauled off and punched him in the nose and gave him a bloody nose. The incident had happened before school started when we were all arriving at the school. And then I left and went inside to class and got called to the office. The principal asked me what happened. I relayed the story. I think I did get some consequences from that. I don't remember exactly what they are. I might have had to go home that day, or a couple times in sixth grade I got in trouble and I had to help the janitor, which I didn't mind. And then the principal was going to call my mom, which I minded a little bit more. The consequence happened. I go home from school. My mom's like, let's talk about what happened. She's asking me, why did you hit somebody? It's not okay to hit people. So I'm relaying the story and I'm telling her that wasn't fair. And again, got the similar answer. Well, Jackie, life isn't fair. Now, here's what I understand now that I didn't have words for then. When I said to my mom, that's not fair, I wasn't making a claim about the nature of the universe. I wasn't saying the world should guarantee fairness. I think I understood, even as a small child between 4 to 6 or at 12, that the world doesn't always work out evenly. What I was trying to communicate and what I was reaching for without the words to get there and articulate what I wanted to express was, I don't expect life to be fair, but I think people should try to be fair. We owe each other an attempt at fairness. Fairness in how we treat each other is something worth caring about. It's worth expecting. And I was naming it when I saw that it was absent. Those are completely different statements. Life isn't fair is a belief about the nature of reality. People should try to be fair is a value. It's a guiding principle about what we owe each other. And what happened in those exchanges with my mom, I don't think it was malicious. I don't think she was dismissing me. She was trying to give me a pragmatic, survival oriented response that made sense from where she stood. But what I received was, your instinct here is naive. The world doesn't work that way. And you're not going to get it to work that way. And over time, when a value gets met with that kind of response enough, something can happen. It either goes underground, where you just stop expressing it because it doesn't land, or it can show up sideways as frustration or an intensity that the people around you can't quite locate because they aren't seeing the deeper thing that it's reaching for. I've been thinking about this story because it's not just my story. I hear versions of it constantly in the work I do. Someone knew something or felt something or expressed something as a child. And the adults around them, for whatever reason, didn't have room for that. Or they misread it, redirected it, told them in one way or another that what they were sensing wasn't real or wasn't appropriate or just wasn't the way the world works. That person can grow up not quite trusting that signal that originated inside their body, not sure if what they said is actually valid. And like me, not being able to name the thing that's been quietly organizing their inner life since they were 4 years old. Here's what I want you to take away from this story. Values can arrive before we have language for them, before we have the developmental framework to articulate them, and before anyone in our life can recognize them and say, yes, that thing that you're feeling, that's real. That's yours. And that's important. And later, sometimes much later, sitting in a therapist's office or a group room or a conversation that cracks something open, we look back and we find it still there, waiting to be reclaimed. The value that was always ours, even when we couldn't name it and nobody around us could see it. If you're listening, the question for you right now is, what did you know when you were young that didn't get received? Or what did you feel that got corrected or redirected or explained away? Because somewhere in the answer to that question is a clue about what you've always valued. One of the things that I think sits underneath a lot of what comes into therapy sessions is beliefs we didn't choose, but we're still trying to operate from. I'm not talking about the beliefs we developed from identifiable wounds, the ones we can trace to a specific event or relationship. I'm talking about something quieter. The beliefs that came in what seemed like the air that we breathed. The ones absorbed so early and so completely that they never felt like beliefs at all. They just felt like this is how things are. If you grew up in a home where emotions were inconvenient, where crying was met with impatience, or where anger was scary, where needing comfort was a burden on the people around you, you probably didn't consciously decide to believe that your feelings were a problem. You just stopped having them where anyone could see. And that becomes a belief. Feelings are private at best, dangerous at worst. If you were raised in a religious or cultural tradition that tied your worth to your goodness, where love, even divine love, felt like something you had to earn through compliance and performance, you probably didn't choose that framework. It was simply the water you swam in, and it went deep. And if you grew up in a family system that had an unspoken rule, that whatever was happening inside the house was not to be named, discussed, or acknowledged outside of it, you learned something very specific. The external story and the internal reality are supposed to be different things. They are not supposed to match. And this one is something I see a lot in the work that I do with clients. I think of it as the appearance gap. The space between what a family presents to the outside world and what's actually happening inside. In some families, maintaining that gap isn't just a preference, it's a survival strategy. The family is a good family, they're a high functioning family, they're a together family. Whatever turbulence or addiction or conflict or pain is happening inside the home, the outside presentation has to hold. Because the external presentation is what actually makes the family safe, acceptable, and respected. Children raised inside those systems learn something profound and damaging. That the truth of what you experience internally is less important than the story that gets told externally. What you feel and what is actually happening matters less than how things appear. And here's what I've noticed in working with people whose compulsive or addictive behavior involves secrecy and deception. So many of them were raised in exactly that kind of system. The behavior, the hiding, the double life, the gap between the presented self and the actual self wasn't invented from scratch. It was a continuation, a pattern already learned, already familiar, already wired in as the way you move through the world when the internal truth is too dangerous to surface. That doesn't excuse the behavior, but it explains something important about where it comes from. As I talked about in a podcast a couple episodes ago about dishonesty, in situations like this, the person isn't just simply choosing dishonesty. They learn to live inside a template, one where internal reality and external performance had always been two different things. And they had been operating inside that template since childhood, long before any of us were asking them to examine it. There's another concept that runs through the appearance gap, through the inherited beliefs, and through the values that got suppressed or misread. And that's the compliance-based identity. A compliance-based identity is an identity built around pleasing, performing, or surviving, rather than about selfhood. It's the self that developed in response to what the external environment required, rather than what the internal truth was asking for. It can look like being the reliable one, the peacekeeping one, the one who doesn't make things hard for everyone else, the one who keeps it together, the one who was agreeable and cheerful, even when something inside felt deeply wrong. And the belief underneath all of that, the one that makes compliance feel necessary, was usually some version of, I'm only acceptable if I am fill in the blank. Easy enough, selfless enough, strong enough, good enough, small enough, together enough. That belief didn't get chosen. It got built out of what the environment rewarded and what it punished, out of what got you warmth and what got you withdrawal, and often out of years of reading the room and adjusting accordingly, until the adjustment became so automatic that you stopped noticing it was happening. And that continues until something breaks, until the body finally says, I'm not holding this anymore. And you find yourself in a therapist's office, listening to a podcast at a strange hour. Or you might find yourself in a group therapy room, trying to figure out what is actually true about you underneath all of that. There's something I often repeat in the work that I do, and I've talked about versions of it on this podcast before, but I'm going to name it again here because I think it is an important thing to name. In a lot of the families and systems that shaped the people that I work with, emotional reality was consistently deprioritized. Not always intentionally and not always with cruelty, but consistently it was deprioritized. What got prioritized instead was functioning. Whether the family operated, whether tasks got done, whether everyone showed up, we had to perform stability. Whether that surface remained calm, whether conflict was avoided, whether the household ran. There was also role fulfillment, whether each person did what they were supposed to do: parent, child, spouse, breadwinner, caretaker. Appearance, whether or not things looked right to the outside world. And endurance, whether people could hold on, push through, keep going without complaint. And because I work with these clients too, the ones who had to fill the role of the scapegoat and the black sheep. Often this gets mixed in with what we call triangulation. They tend to get placed in a role where the conflict between parents or the tension in the family gets transferred onto them. And then they act out the opposite. They carry the shame of the family. They are the problem in the family. They're the opposite of what the good members of the family are doing. And nobody else has to look bad, feel shame, because that's all given to the scapegoat. When these roles consistently come at the expense of emotional truth, and when the family's implicit message is what you feel or who you are is less important than what we need you to do, something gets trained out of people. They stop acknowledging their internal experience. They trust that what they feel or who they are doesn't matter. And they often lose language for what's happening inside of them. In its place, a set of relational patterns develop. I see them so often that honestly, they've started to feel like a constellation. I can see the pattern. It's recognizable, it's connected, it's almost always appearing together. Shrinking, taking up less space than you're entitled to, editing yourself before you even speak. Or on the other hand, going big, being the problem, holding the tension and the conflict in the family. It can look like excessive loyalty, where you stay past the point where staying makes sense, because to leave would feel like a moral failure. Or you're overly accommodating, instinctually adapting to what others need without checking in with what you need, and staying connected by minimizing the self. Learning that the price of belonging is making yourself smaller. And what strikes me every time that I see those patterns is that underneath them, almost without exception, are people who deeply value exactly the opposite. People who value emotional honesty, real connection, being truly seen and truly knowing someone else. Mutual understanding, not just the performed version of it, but the real thing, the genuine thing. The patterns aren't evidence that those values weren't there. They're evidence that those values often were there all along in systems that didn't have room for them. And so the person adapted. They learned to want what the system could offer and to put away, sometimes for decades, what the system couldn't hold. I work with a number of women who are in a healing process from betrayal, from CPTSD, from the accumulated weight of relational systems that asked a great deal of them and gave back very little. And something I notice again and again is a particular tension, a double bind. On one hand, these women are awakening to something. They're beginning to genuinely want their own voice, their own authority over their lives. Empowerment is the word that comes up, and it's real. I can see that it's trying to create a space so that it can take root. And at the same time, underneath that, often running parallel to it without the person even recognizing it, there's a pull toward the familiar. A wish, somewhere quiet, for someone else to speak for them, to protect them, to carry some of the weight. That can look like contradiction, but I think the double bind language is more accurate and captures what many women were taught about connection. The message that's embedded in many religious traditions, in the relational blueprints passed down through generations of women who had very few options, was connection comes through self-sacrifice. Belonging is earned by making yourself available, making yourself useful, making yourself secondary. You are loved insofar as you give, and you are loved insofar as you serve. That message goes so deep that it shapes the nervous system's template for what intimacy feels like. So when someone begins to reclaim herself, when she starts to assert her needs, draw boundaries, take up space, it can feel neurologically and emotionally like she is threatening the very connection she most wants. Even when the connection she's in is one that's harming her or no longer working for her. The value of empowerment is real, and it is hers. And the pull toward protection is also real and comes from somewhere valid. Both things can be true at the same time, and their work isn't to eliminate one in favor of the other. It's to hold both, look at where they come from, and begin to sort out what she is actually choosing from what she was trained to need. I want to share another thing that I see from the work that I do. This will be a composite picture that's drawn from real sessions with the details changed to protect identity. But the emotional and clinical truth of it is still intact. I've been working with a client for several years now. When we first started, they told me what brought them to therapy, which is often a question I ask. And it was a moment of conflict with their teen child, a rupture that felt to them disproportionately significant. It was a repeated pattern, but that conflict in particular, there was something different and it brought them into therapy. In our early sessions, the client told me something. They said, I overreact to things that aren't that big of a deal. But the way that I react is like it's the end of the world. As we went deeper into the work, I said to them at one point, this overreaction, acting like it's the end of the world, actually makes sense because your world did end. When this person was a child, young, in that window where a child's whole world is their family and the home they live in, their parent died. And not in a way that they were prepared for or anything that softened the blow of that happening. It was a regular day until it wasn't. 911 was called. They actually never went back to the home they lived in before this. They moved, changed schools, lost the texture of the life they had known. Everything changed on what had seemed like any other day. When I told them, your world did end, I was being accurate. And if I remember correctly, something clicked in the moment for that client. That's at the core of what we're talking about today. There was a belief they had been carrying. I overreact to things that aren't a big deal. That's actually not a character flaw. It was a conclusion, a reasonable conclusion made by someone who had learned at a formative age that an ordinary day could suddenly become the worst day of their life. Of course, their nervous system stayed alert. Of course, it treated small things as though they might be catastrophic. Because one time, one of them was. That belief that they held wasn't inaccurate, given what they had experienced. It was understandable. It made sense. And it had been quietly organizing their behavior, their relationships, and their emotional responses for decades. Most recently, this client and I were talking about their relationship with their now adult children. They shared that when the kids come to them, when they bring their needs or their stress or their need just to be heard, sometimes the client can still get very frustrated, feeling pulled in a direction that they don't have space for in that moment. Their reactions aren't so extreme anymore. After one of these interactions with their adult children, they circled back to the child who had come to them and apologized. That adult child and the client had a good conversation. And in our session, the client said, I think they just need me to listen. And I asked whether it felt like in those moments, like the child was asking them to go back to a version of parenting that was bigger, more present, more doing than what's actually needed now. Because I think there's something important about how approval works across a lifespan. We are born needing approval from our parents. It's developmental necessity. A child needs to be seen, claimed, delighted in by the people who are in their world. That need should be met early and generously. Not perfectly. Parents get to be human. But the baseline should be you are known, you are precious, and you are believed in. And as children grow into adults, what they need from us shifts. They don't need us to do it for them anymore. They need to know that we trust them to figure out their lives, that we're here as a sounding board for reassurance, for a reality check, but that we genuinely believe they are capable and that we aren't feeling that we need to rescue them because we don't believe they're drowning. When a parent hasn't fully made that transition, when some part of them is still oriented toward the version of parenting that was needed when the child was small, whether that's their child or their inner child, it can create friction with adult children who sense that. Not because the parent doesn't love them, but because the parent is in some ways living inside an old belief about what's needed. Near the end of a recent session, we were talking about those old beliefs, the ones that were formed early in crisis and survival, the ones that still come calling today, even now, years into the work. And I think I said something like, those beliefs and conclusions, that you came to when you were younger, they're valid. They may not be entirely accurate, but totally understandable given what you knew and given what you experienced, given the age that you were when you made those conclusions. Makes complete sense that you would come to those conclusions. I said, and those voices can still haunt us. My client responded and said, yeah, I think I need to stay away from those voices. And I said, I don't actually think stepping away from the voice is how it works. I think we have to face those voices, acknowledge where they came from, understand why we believed and what we believed, and then meet those voices with our current knowledge, the wisdom we've gained, the self-affirming self-talk that we've built slowly over time. That's how the voices actually stop running the show. Not by avoiding them, but by engaging with them. By saying, I see you. I remember. I understand where you came from. And I also now know something that I didn't know then. When we engage in that dialogue, the voice dissipates. That to me is the heart of belief work. Not just simply replacing old beliefs with new affirmations, not performing positivity over the top of pain, but actually turning toward the voice, getting curious about it, giving it its due, acknowledging that it made sense, that it was formed in response to something real, and offering it something more true today. I want to share one more piece of work. Again, composite, anonymized, but emotionally true. I have a client who has been doing significant recovery work. And they came into a session recently and told me about a stretch of time, about 2 weeks, if I remember right, that they had felt genuinely different. They'd been living more authentically, not performing for the people around them, not adapting themselves to become whoever the room seemed to need, just staying true to who they actually are. And they said it felt so good, real, like something that was actually possible, that they hadn't been sure was possible for them. And then they had a rough day at work. Several things went wrong in quick succession. One of them was a technical issue that cascaded, the kind of thing where you call for technical help and you get passed around. Frustration builds not just from the original problem, but from the helplessness of not being able to get the help, or the help can't get it to work either, where you're feeling at the mercy of something that you can't control. I think we've all had those experiences. By the end of the day, they had exhausted their capacity to tolerate discomfort. And they returned to a coping behavior they had been working really hard to step away from. When we talked about it in our session, I asked them about growing up. I knew some of the backstory, but I wanted to bring it present into our session about what it was like when things felt overwhelming as a child. And what they described was a picture a lot of people in this work recognize. There weren't other options. There wasn't someone to turn to who could absorb some of the feeling with them. There wasn't a reliable person who could be called on when things felt too much. The relief they had to find was relief they could find alone. And over time, the compulsive behavior became that relief. When they were young, it was the only thing that was always available. There's something in their life now that wasn't there before. They've been building a relationship where the other person is genuinely present. They're available. They're interested. The kind of relational experience that is, for this person, relatively new. And I reminded them that was real. That person is real and available to you, but they're not available on demand. And those are different things. On that rough day at work, there was no one waiting by the phone. The person they're close to had their own day, their own obligations, their own schedule. A text might go a while without a response. And in that window, in that gap between reaching out and being reached back, the old reflex stepped in. The thing I wanted this client to hold on to is we can tolerate a really bad day, a genuinely bad day, the kind where multiple things go wrong, and by the end of it, you are depleted. We can tolerate that. And we can reach out to someone and not have them respond immediately. And we can tolerate that too. Because the conversation that happens later, when there's time and attention and real presence, that conversation is worth more than what the old coping behavior offered. It's richer. It's real. It's actually satisfying in a way the compulsive behavior never quite was, no matter how many times it was returned to. But getting there does require something that recovery asks of us over and over again: the capacity to sit in the gap, to tolerate the space between needing something and having it, and to trust that what's coming is coming and it's worth waiting for. That's not a skill that people who grew up without reliable comfort learn naturally. It has to be built slowly through experience that accumulates over time and teaches the nervous system something that it wasn't taught before. In fact, the exact opposite, that help is coming. You don't have to do this alone. And you can wait because waiting is worth it. 2 weeks of authentic living, followed by one hard day, isn't a failure. It's the actual shape of recovery. The 2 weeks are real. They count, they matter. The hard day is also real. And we have to bring both into the picture. I want to end with the practical piece from the exercise in Allison's group that started all of this. Because everything we've talked about today is more useful when it has somewhere to go. You can do this right now in your head, or you can pause, get something to write with, and do it on paper. Either way. Step 1, the free list. Without editing or filtering, write, what are your values and beliefs? Or if you're driving, just think about, what are your values and beliefs? Everything that comes to mind. Words, phrases, full sentences if you want. Just let them come and don't judge whether they're good or accurate or whether you're actually living by them. Just get them out. Some of the things on that list will be values. Some will be beliefs. Some will be things you inherited. And some you might not be able to categorize yet. That's fine. Just make the list. Step 2, now we want to go through what you wrote and we want to start noticing. For each thing, ask the question, does this feel chosen or earned, learned, inherited? Does this feel like I should or I choose? Does this feel like a compass pointing me forward or a rule I've always been following? Does this feel resonant or does it feel heavy? Now, at this stage, we're not sorting perfectly. Some things will be clear. Many might be murky. That's probably exactly right because you're just noticing. Step 3, we're going to do a body check. For the things that feel unclear, try this. Bring the word or phrase to mind and just notice what happens in your body. Is there a sense of opening, settling, a quiet yes? Or is there tightening, heaviness, the feeling of I have to rather than I want to? Your body has been tracking things that your conscious mind wasn't allowed to track. So this is just an invitation to listen to it. Step 4, for any survival or limiting beliefs you find, the ones that feel heavy, rigid, formed from something painful, don't try to replace this belief. Just hold it alongside what Allison calls a curious truth. Not a forced reframe, not a positive affirmation pasted over the top, just a possibility you're willing to be curious about. If one of the beliefs is, I can't trust myself, a curious truth would sound like, my intuition may have been overridden, but it may not be broken. A phrase like, I should have known better, in the curious truth would sound like, I trusted based on the information I had. If there's a belief that I'm too much, the curious truth may be that maybe my needs are reasonable. If there's a belief that I will always be this way, curious truth would say, change is something I've already done before, even without noticing. You don't have to believe the curious truth at this point. That's the whole point of calling it curious. You're just practicing not being entirely imprisoned by the familiar belief. You're practicing a dialogue with the voice rather than running from it. And then step 5, pick one value from your list that genuinely feels like it's yours. We're going to start with just one and ask, what would it feel like this week to practice this value toward myself? Not toward others, just toward yourself in the actual texture of your daily life. If you value compassion, what is one compassionate thing you could say to yourself about where you are each day? If you value honesty, what is one truth about your own experience that you haven't let yourself fully acknowledge yet? If you value connection, is there one person you could let a little closer this week? Not by performing and not managing, but just letting them into something real with you. Write it down if you can, because sometimes we forget after the exercise ends. And then just try to implement it. It won't be perfect. We're just going to try. The values that resonate most deeply with us, the ones that feel like coming home when we finally find the right words for them, are often not new. They're usually there pretty early, often before we had language for them, sometimes before anyone around us could recognize them. Sometimes showing up as a 4-year-old saying, that's not fair, to a mother who had a completely different answer in mind. They're shaped by the systems that we grew up in. They're suppressed by the environments that didn't have room for them. They might have been mistaken for other things entirely, for stubbornness or sensitivity or naivety, or making a big deal out of nothing. But they didn't disappear. They went somewhere. They went into the body, into the nervous system, into the relational patterns that look on the outside like shrinking or over-accommodating or excessive loyalty, but are actually underneath people trying to belong in systems that couldn't hold what they actually were. The beliefs were formed along the way. the survival beliefs, the inherited beliefs, the ones we concluded from experience. They all make sense. They're reasonable given what we knew, how old we were, what the environment was asking of us or requiring from us. We come to them honestly. They kept us functional, even if they were inaccurate, and even if they were costing us something that we couldn't name yet. And those voices, the old beliefs, the old conclusions, they'll still call to you. It's not a sign that you're not doing enough healing. It's just a sign that those beliefs were formed in response to something real. And they're not supposed to just step aside because you decided you're ready to move on. You don't step away from them by avoiding them. You step away from them by turning toward them, facing them, seeing them, acknowledging where they come from, and by saying, I understand. I also know something now that I didn't know then. By meeting those old voices with your compassionate current wisdom and knowledge, and engaging in the dialogue, those voices will soften until what they're telling you stops becoming a command and becomes instead something you can notice. That's the work that we often talk about. It's slow, it's not linear, but it is genuinely possible. Noticing is not doing it wrong. And what was always yours, the values, the knowing, the thing you were reaching for, even if you didn't have the words, is still there, waiting for you to find your way back to it and to reclaim it. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening to this episode. If something resonated with you, I'd love to hear about it. If you're doing the work figuring out real values from inherited beliefs, I'd love to hear about that too. Drop a comment, hit like, leave a review, and share if you think somebody else could benefit from this episode. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. There's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.